This is Dennis Ramundi. I'm here with my co-host, Phil Goldberg. Our podcast and YouTube channel, Spirit Matters Talk, found at spiritmatterstalk.com. If you go to YouTube, just type in the 3 words, Spirit Matters Talk, and it'll come up. We have many, many shows in our archives, about 300. And we do ask, if you're listening or watching, hit the subscribe button. We would appreciate that. It costs nothing. We are committed to keeping our show free and available to everyone. And for those people that have contributed to help us do that, thank you very much. And if anybody would like to do that, go to spiritmatterstalk.com. We have as our guest today, Willa Blythe Baker. She is a Ph.D. She has a doctorate from Harvard University. She's the founder and spiritual director of Natural Dharma Fellowship in Boston, Massachusetts, and its retreat center in Wonderwell Mountain Refuge in Springfield, New Hampshire. She was authorized as a Dharma teacher and lineage holder in the Kagyu lineage, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, of Tibetan Buddhism. Tremendous background in that area and much to talk about her today. She's the author of several books, which we'll also be discussing and giving you information on today. So thank you so very much for taking the time to come on with us today.
Thank you so much, Dennis. And thanks, Phil, for having me on Spirit Matters.
It's great. I'm really glad our mutual friend, Dean Slider, told us about you. We're delighted to have you with us. You have a really interesting background, as most of our guests do, but yours is really unusual. And we always like our listeners to have a sense of the sort of spiritual history of our guests. So if you can give us an overview of what set you on a spiritual path and why it took the direction it did to Tibetan Buddhism.
Well, it's always hard, to trace back exactly when one's interest began. For me, was it when I was 4 years old, 5 years? I mean, I remember being, as a child, curious about what was beyond the realm of what I could see, and what I was experiencing with my senses. I was interested in big questions. Even, I don't know, I can remember being 8 and being, trying to figure out whether space had an end or not. I remember laying on my back and just ruminating, could space have an end or not? And I remember then I worked on, chewed on that for a while. And then I chewed on, does time have an end or not? And does it have a beginning? Or is there always a moment before? And just, those kinds of existential questions, I was drawn to those pretty young. But then I also was born into a family of these kind of atheist intellectuals who had a little bit of a mystical side. My mother had a bit of a mystical side. And although she was a recovering Baptist, she also had this, she was drawn to spiritualities, Eastern spiritualities. My stepfather and my father both also practiced Zen. So these books were laying around when I was a child and teenager that I picked up. Like I remember picking up Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. And it's so simply written, so straightforwardly written. So a 12-year-old reading that can get it. And it was really hitting some of his things that he said in there, like sorry, I'm having a moment to cut this part out. But, like those parts where he says that in the mind of a beginner, the possibilities are many, but in the mind of an expert, they are few. Those kinds of things were just really struck me as, oh, that's true. So I was drawn pretty young to Buddhism and to spirituality. And then when I was about 8, my mother took me down to the Transcendental Meditation Center in Berkeley, and I learned how to meditate. And I know that you guys have a background too now in
I'll bet it was
TM.
Channing Way.
It was Channing Way. It was
Right, we
Channing
know it
Way.
well.
Yes.
Yeah, I was in
Yes.
Cambridge at the time, but many friends out there. So I wanted to ask you, your parents today would be categorized as being spiritual but not religious, probably, right?
Yes.
Then
Yes.
they were very spiritual. Was there a point where when you made the decision to sort of pursue this, maybe it was when you started TM or whenever, did it come from your intellect, maybe a combination of both, wanting to get answers to those questions you were having, those very deep, meaningful, basic questions of life? Or was there an experience you had when you started meditating, whatever, that triggered something that, hey, there's more going on than I thought, and this is what I pursue? Or is it a combination of both those or something else?
I think it was primarily the experiences that I had early on in
Mhm.
sitting practice. And even then, even back being pretty young, I picked up that the intention of this practice is to experience peace. And it's possible to experience inner peace, not on the basis of the conditions of your life, but on the basis of turning inwards and developing a skill that helps you find refuge in your own peace. I picked that up really early. I think any kid could understand that. We understand that when we're afraid and things are turbulent, we understand when we feel happy and peaceful. So I understood the intention and then started undertaking the practice and found that it was so, that I did. My nervous system would settle down, and there was just this permission to be just in the present moment without any other agenda. This permission, encouragement even. And I found that so soothing as a child and teenager. I went ahead and did their teenager course, and none of that was pushed by my parents. It was all me. I wanted to know how to deepen in this practice.
Well, I certainly envy you being exposed to things like that at that age, because I was in my 20s when I first read Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, and all the other influences. How did you end up, or I shouldn't say end up, but what brought you to Tibetan Buddhism and being ordained as the Lama, which is not all that common for Americans, especially American women?
Right.
Initially, I was drawn to Buddhism sort of as a larger idea, and Hinduism. Early on, right, you don't really know the difference. When I was really young, I didn't really know the difference. But my mother used to take us to the Nyingma Center in Berkeley on Hillside, I think it was Hillside Avenue. And that was a Tibetan Buddhist center. And she would take us for Friday night when I was, me and my stepsister, when I was, maybe 9, 10, to these dinners on Friday night. And there would be a dinner, and then after that would be a meditation. What I knew at that time, even at that time, was that I felt very drawn to the aesthetics of that center. The colors were so deep and vibrant. There was this maroon, so different from the Zen environments that I had been in,
Right.
and different again from the ashrams, right? Everything has its own kind of tone. And I was so drawn to the imagery of the deities, the complexity, and all the color and all the richness of that. I felt really drawn to that. But then it really came down to, I would say my interest was solidified or cemented when I was looking to do a junior year abroad. And I knew I wanted to do it in a country where meditation was a practice, or people practiced Dharma or practiced particularly Buddhism. And my choices were very limited. at that time in the 80s, I had two choices actually at that time that I knew of, at least that the international programs abroad office at Vassar had two options for me. One was Japan, and the other was Nepal, and to live with Tibetans and study Tibetan and be in a refugee kind of environment. And the Japanese program, I just came down to affordability. The Japanese program was twice as expensive as the program in Nepal. And I was like, well, that's the answer for me in my poor student days. I was like, okay, let's go with the bargain here. And ended up there. Yeah. And when I was there, just fell in love with the Tibetan people, primarily the people and the culture and the way that they were as a community, deeply rooted, interconnected, generally just a jolly people who had gone through so much suffering recently with their exile and then living in refugee camps and in poverty and in sickness, and still maintaining their cheerfulness and sense of humor was so moving to me. As a people, that was their kind of way of encountering the difficult, was with some fortitude. They were tough, funny, and fun to be around. So that initially drew me into the.
Now, when we went there, did you notice a change in the quality of your inner experiences of your meditations? Your external experience, obviously, very different, very enjoyable and festive, almost like in a great way, what life should be, maybe. But internally, were you also experiencing a difference?
Yes, I was. And one way I was experiencing a difference was through my relationship to my body. That at that time, I was struggling in college as a young college student with my sense of my relationship to my body image and being, just being surrounded by young women who were dieting and counting calories and trying to be as thin as possible. And that really rubbed off on me and deeply affected my sense of self-worth and my sense of, it went deeper than just my relationship to my body. It went down into the relationship to the self. And when I got to Nepal, I just encountered this very different culture where body was more like coextensive with everyone else's bodies. And I felt like I was living in a communal body and felt supported by that. And somehow that just shifted my relationship to my body. And at the same time, there were these deity images on the walls, many of them of women, powerful, enlightened women on the walls of these temples. I'd never seen anything like that in the West or anywhere. I suppose in Catholic monasteries, there must be Mary is probably there, right? That I'm sure that people of other faiths have these kinds of religions, but it felt like, these kinds of experiences, but it felt like these bodies were mirroring back to me potential. You could be powerful and beautiful in yourself too. And so I was really moved by those images.
So if I can follow up, Phil, because I had this conversation came up in another context recently, and the pressure on women in Western culture now, especially with social media and everything, where self-identity is totally tied to a particular physical expectation of what you should be or what an ideal is, whereas what these folks were talking about with meditation, there was a change in self-identity, and that change went from that to their inner core, to their inner being, and this seems to be a huge issue right now in education, especially education of women, that needs to be, that's very much affected by one having a way to go inward.
Yes. And to discover that self is so deep, that we can find refuge in And this also was opening up for me too in Nepal and in the practices there that emphasize that we are primordially awake, that some part of us is primordially awake, that we don't have to make ourselves more awake, although we could practice, and that makes room to encounter that primordial wakefulness. But that idea that there is refuge already present in the soul or the body mind or whatever you want to call it, that we can find a place of refuge inside, helps disidentify with this notion of that myself is my name, how I look, or whatever else. those very transitory identities are not all we are. We're so much more. Yeah.
This is a good segue to your new book, The Wakeful Body. Wait, let me read the subtitle, which is Somatic Mindfulness as a Path to Freedom. So I want to know about what led you to write this book, which sounds body-oriented. Well, let's just go there directly. Why that book? And I have questions about the book, but tell us about what led to it.
Essentially, the book is it's a manifesto about the power of the body to take the lead in our practice of meditation. And the book reflects where I am right now with my own practice. And this is exactly, if you know, someone were to ask me right now, what do you practice? I would say, if you want to know what I practice, this is what I practice.
Hold it up. Hold it up.
This is what I practice. Yeah, the Wakeful Body is the book. And yeah, my practice has come back home to the body. I kind of went away from the body in some ways, and then came back home to the body through a number of avenues. And one of them is discovering over time that, you know, in Buddhist circles, the word mind is very popular. And in the Buddhist scriptures and texts, mind and nature of mind and consciousness and awareness. I have great love for all of those words and what they mean. A deep love, deep part of my practice. But it's also possible to, as Westerners especially, who are already somewhat disembodied, we are already so trained in our minds, and we are already pretty thinking, we think enough. We think enough as it is. And you give us a word like mind, at least me, a word like mind. And I subtly believed for years, I think, that this thing, nature of mind awareness, was somehow up above the neck and maybe sort of out there, this mystical, disembodied, infinite awareness that I could encounter, and it would help me transcend this earthly life. And in that, what does that do for the body? It kind of leaves it behind, like just not very important. It's something to be discarded at the end of life, and then we move on, right? Maybe that's true, but while we're alive, we are embodied, and the body is our tie to our emotions, to compassion, to many kinds of wisdoms that we couldn't encounter any other way. It's the doorway to the senses. And how else are we going to rest in the present moment if we don't have contact with those senses? So I slowly discovered myself, just by looking at my own practice and my own process, that I kind of mentalized my meditation practice, a bit entangled with thinking. And And my way back from that mentalization was to start grounding in the body and feeling the body's connection to the earth and letting that bring me back home into this feeling, sensing, complex human animal being that is the foundation for waking up. And so, yeah.
Dennis, let me follow up if I can. In putting the book together or in doing whatever research you did you draw from other sources other than the Buddhist text, the Buddhist tradition? And two more questions. If so, how has the work gone over in the Buddhist community? And does any of that have to do with, and this is a personal question, so you can choose not to answer, because I saw in your first early books, you use the title of Lama, and you're not on this book. So 3 related questions.
Okay, first question. First question, yes, I am. I did draw on other sources of wisdom other than those of the Buddhist tradition, because that's actually what I do as a human being. I seek wisdom in many forms. I love to read literature. I'm a lover of poetry. I love to read poetry. I get wisdom, I get Dharma, I get transmission, I get teaching from poetry of all religious traditions, actually. And other denominations other than Tibetan Buddhism. Zen poetry is amazing. So I am eclectic as a human being in terms of where I seek out wisdom. And if it resonates, then it's wisdom. And I love to read the science around the body's wisdom. And so I did some reading around the body's wisdom from other sources, like articles on neuroscience, on interoception, did some reading on interoception, proprioception, and what these terms mean in psych circles and in science, from the scientific point of view, physiological point of view. And I found those, sometimes what I discovered there really resonated with my own practice of meditation and with the teachings of the Tibetan tradition and with the Himalayan tradition that talks so much about body as this enlightened thing, this naturally enlightened entity. There's this term Vajra body that we find in the Buddhist texts that means the deathless body that is permeating your flesh and blood body, and or sometimes it's called the subtle body in these Buddhist texts. It's a body that's made of energy and light, a prana body, and that we can contact that with our attention. And by contacting that, we actually can self-regulate our emotions and even our practice, even our own awakening. We can kind of orchestrate our awakening through paying attention to the body. And these traditions make so much sense from if looking at, say, the literature on interoception, the scientific literature that shows that we can train internal bodily self-awareness, that can be entrained. We can grow our IA, our interoceptive awareness, through training. This is what scientists have found, and that's essentially what yogis are doing. So reading some of this other literature helped me think about my own practice and tradition in a different light. And what else? Oh, you asked a number of questions.
Asked about how the work was received in the Buddhist community, and then I impertinently asked about your use of the title of Lama.
Okay. Yeah.
For some reason, yeah.
Okay. So yeah, the Buddhist community, I am still, it's too early to say. I don't know yet. I don't know yet. There've been a couple, only one, couple of reviews of the book, but they've been very neutral. There hasn't been any sort of debating kind of reviews. I'd sort of hoped that maybe a little bit more of some critical reviews might come out of the book, or maybe someone would write. I mean, of course, I want them to love the book. Of course, who doesn't? Who writes a book? You want your reviewer to love the book, but also, you know, to debate with it a little bit. Or I haven't quite had that happen yet, so I don't know. So far, so good, I guess. Yeah.
I'm curious. You run retreats, so somebody comes on the retreat, and let's say I don't know if you run advanced or beginner retreats, but let's say it's people coming for the first time. Where do you start them, and how do you introduce them to these concepts?
Well, I start by pointing out that your body is grounded, and that if you pay attention, the body is pulled. So what do I do in my retreats on somatic mindfulness? I begin with the earth, what I call the earth body, which means that we have this very material, grounded, flesh and blood body. We are animals, and we are married to the earth, whether we want to be or not. If we jump, right, we're going to come right back to the earth. That groundedness in itself is a profound Dharma teaching. So if you want to deepen in your meditation practice, if you want to deepen in a practice of peace and stability, simply paying attention to that grounded quality of your body can help you become more grounded with the mind, the heart, the soul, just by paying attention to that and beginning to saturate that feeling of groundedness in your own body. So I start with that. But from there, explore other layers of embodiment. And in the Himalayan traditions of Buddhism, in the Buddhisms that come out of this really interesting hybrid of Buddhism and Kashmiri Shaivism, which was very body-focused and yogic. This marriage of these two traditions and this blending yielded this particular type of Buddhism that's unlike any other, in that the body is this place of alchemy where awakening occurs. And it occurs in the core of the body in those traditions, in this place called the central channel that's running from the crown of your head to the base of your spine. That awakening happens in the core of your body. So in these retreats, I explore the different layers of embodiment that we can contact, and then encounter ourselves as embodied beings and begin to awaken from the bottom up instead of just from the top down. We can't think our way to enlightenment, but we can feel our way to enlightenment. So that's basically what happens in those. And your question, Phil, about my title Lama, because I didn't get to that. Is that, yeah, I've stopped using it in the wider world pretty much. I mean, I don't know that it's understood by our culture what these titles mean or what they are necessarily. Roshi, Lama. I understand that by using them, maybe you're educating others that there are these different titles, like in our culture, it's the venerable so-and-so, or the or sister so-and-so, brother so-and-so, right? We have our own, in these different religious traditions, our own ways of addressing or the ordained. But I also am concerned about using the title beyond my own vessel of teaching, where I do still use it, or rather it's there. If someone wants to use it, they can. They don't have to. But I worry about projections about that go along with any title, venerable or, and I'm just more comfortable just being human in whatever context I'm in, because that's all that I am personally. So I feel that, you know, projecting, oh, they must be very evolved, or they must be enlightened because they have this title, or they must be, that I don't know that that's useful in general. So
thank you. I appreciate the honesty of the answer. That's why I stopped calling Dennis Your Holiness.
Even
It was
though
going to his
intending it,
head. But speaking of that, our mutual friend Dean told me that you have spoken out and have been engaged in speaking out about sexual abuse that's come up in the Buddhist world, as it has, as we all know, in the Hindu and yoga worlds as well. Would you want to speak to that?
Sure, I can. Yeah, there's been, I mean, it's always been there. I don't think that it's not been there, and then suddenly now we have, there's something new going on. I think that there has wherever there are people in power, there is the possibility that that power can be misused. And I think it's happened in all traditions, all religions, and that more recently, there's been a Me Too wave in Buddhism, and along with all of the rest of the world has been having its Me Too moment. And you may even say it began before it was even in the wider culture. It was starting in the Buddhist circles. Yeah, I think that that any religion is prone to that. So yeah, so I did. There was a moment there in myself too when I was speaking up against that misuse of power in the tradition. My concerns about primarily how these communities that we are a part of, congregations, religious communities, whatever you want to call them, Dharma centers, are structured. I think a lot of the issue, of course, some of it is human nature. Humans in power use the power that they have to get what they want, and that's a human thing. It's not exotic. But some of it, the problem is in the structures of our organizations that don't have safety measures in place to make sure that people in our organizations, women and men, are protected from that possibility of the misuse of power. And there are structures that you can put in place, like ethics boards and places to, ways to complain if you feel harassed. And that's still very new. There are many Buddhist organizations that don't still have those safeties in place. And until they're put in place, there will be harm. So that concerned me, and it was very much a part of my own life. I was in a relationship with my teacher for years, and it took me a long time to begin to understand the unhealthy nature of that. Well before there was any Me Too movement, so we don't know that much. And then I encountered many other people. Have encountered many other people. I would say, well over a dozen women primarily who have been in the same position. Well over a dozen, maybe even 24 since I wrote my articles on coming out and speaking out, who have been in this exactly the same position, and it is almost universally deeply painful and disempowering, as much as I'd like to believe it could be otherwise. And maybe sometimes it is otherwise, I don't know. But I haven't seen a great outcome for an uneven power dynamic and relationships with ministers or whatever, especially when secrecy is involved. It's very toxic. And yeah.
Thank you for that.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a final question from my side, and that is that You're the author of several books, and you also widely published. You write a lot of articles. What is your focus now? Is there anything in particular? Is there, well, this book is relatively new, so it's out there. But any articles or books or thoughts you have, areas to explore in the future?
Oh, thank you for asking. I'm currently working on a translation of a Tibetan text from Tibetan into English of a memoir by a 17th century yogi, no, 18th century yogi, who writes about the natural world and how it inspires him to practice these amazing deep practices of meditation, and then how the natural world is informing his practice. So working on that. And I have an article coming out on embodiment, a kind of a follow-up to the book a little bit, in disembodiment and embodiment, that will be published on the Mind and Life website. Good look for that too.
And I should add that you have on your website, I noticed a Dharma talk coming up virtually called Natural Dharma. And that's on May 8th. So we want our listeners to know about that. And it will be on the taramandala.org website. We'll have that posted. Speaking of that, Willa, one last question, if you can answer it briefly. Your talk coming up is called Natural Dharma. You have an early book called Everyday Dharma. And so the word Dharma is used in different ways by different people. And most of our listeners have heard it. They may, have a sense of what it means. It's often makes me nuts when it's translated as duty. And so I'm wondering how you mean the term and how you use it in your teaching.
So it's a multivalent term. And in Sanskrit texts and texts of other Asian languages also, the term is multivalent. So it doesn't just have one meaning. It
Right.
can mean phenomena, it can mean duty or purpose even. And it can mean way or path.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I most often relate to Dharma as path, or the way that I think of Dharma is as one's way of proceeding or way of being. That is Dharma. And I also think of Dharma as the teaching or the expressions of truth, which could be coming from any direction. So like I was saying, I get the Dharma from poetry and from science and so I would be saying I find my truths in all of those sources. So Dharma as truth can mean truth. Yeah, so I guess for me, it means way, and it also means truth. Yeah.
You're a Dharma bum.
I'm a Dharma bum. That's right.
Dean's new book, by the way. Yeah.
Right.
I know.
We'll have him on soon.
I love the book.
Maybe we could, one last time, hold up your book.
Okay. Yeah,
So
it's the Wakeful
Body. We'll have everything posted up, the Wakeful Body. So that's now available. And great.
Thank you so much for being with us. It's been a great pleasure, and we hope we'll have you back again another time, because there's a lot more I wish we had time to explore. But everybody go see Willa Blythe Baker's website and check out
we'll have all of that posted up, by the way. So
and continue the good work. Be well.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Dennis. Thanks for having me on. And thank you all the watchers and listeners out there. Thank you.
Great.
This is Dennis here with Phil again to do a little discussion. By the way, I didn't have my sweater on during the interview, but it's cool where I am, so I put it on. And so if you've noticed that, you're very observant. She was terrific, very articulate, knowledgeable, really embodied a lot of, I think, of what you spoke about, balance and harmony and happiness, and an interesting area she's in.
Yeah, and a tremendously interesting background. I could have talked about that with her forever. You know, to have been immersed in an ancient tradition like Tibetan Buddhism, and like we said, not that many Westerners go so far as to become ordained as lamas, and very few women in particular. So she was deeply immersed in it, and now is more eclectic in what she draws from. And I find that kind of thing fascinating. And it's the eclecticism of, you know, people teaching who are trained in one tradition but draw on others is probably much more, well, it's certainly more possible and happens much more often now than ever before.
Yeah, I mean, and also just the background, the fact that she was grew up in the United States. She went to Vassar, which is up in New York State, and then she went from there on her third year overseas. You know, most people go to maybe Europe or whatever. She went to Nepal, and she was in a Tibetan community. And I'm sure I didn't ask her. Next interview we do with her, I'd like to ask her what the cultural shock was like coming back from that, because
Yeah, I'll bet.
it's quite a stark difference. But she took whatever she learned there, whatever she was given there, and she integrated it into her life, and she went and got her Ph.D., which is no small matter.
No.
And so I'm sure she drew from many sources during that period of time, and now she runs that center, and they have retreats and whatnot, and seems to be very, very, very active in that.
And the embodiment issue is very interesting, because I think it's been building and building and building for years in the world of meditation practices, mindfulness practices, and yoga. Well, yoga is now very embodied, maybe too oriented.
When we think of yoga, we think of yoga asana as
so
it's a separation of the two. And that was a question, I mean, I'd like to ask you next time, go into a little bit more. What does it mean, and how do you get embodied? Is it through physical practices, or because you made it sound like a lot of being more embodied came from your mental practice?
Yes, and I was looking at the table of contents of her book, and she has a section on what she calls the earth body, a section on the subtle body, a section on what she calls the truth body, which reminds me of the koshas, you know, what are called the sheaths surrounding the eternal self, becoming, you know, increasingly physical. They usually call the causal body, the subtle body, it's pranic bodies. And so I was going to ask her about that connection, but there's a lot of practices in this, and some of them are meditative, some of them have to do with posture and breath, and, you know, just going by the headings in her chapters. So she probably draws on a lot of different methods of, you know, embodiment, and I think that's a trend, because there was a emphasis on the transcendent and the not identifying with the body and identifying with spirit. And if you take that too far, you know, you don't take care of your body, and you get sick and you get old quickly, and you're not living fully in the human, you know, incarnation.
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the things that Hatha yoga has brought to the West. You know, we see in the United States that back in the day, where you know, like I'm talking about, like even in the 60s, 70s, when you heard about meditation, you didn't necessarily think about a person being physically fit or healthy, and it was Hatha yoga that came along, and the Hatha yoga teachers had really promoted that very much, to the point where some of the magazines like Yoga Journal, there's an overemphasis on, sort of the physical stature and appearance of somebody without really delving into the fact that that is developed so that one can have a deeper inner experience. I mean, they do both. Not to pick on Yoga Journal.
There's always these oscillating correctives going on. So people got too ethereal, and then they had to remember they still
give you both here,
and they're still and they're still embodied. And then people get all obsessed with the body and forget they're more than the body. So, the responsible teachers have always been very balanced about that. I mean, you go back to, all the gurus who came here that I wrote about in American Veda, they all, reminded people that the body is, to use traditional language, the vehicle for enlightenment, and that the body is important and taking care of it is important. And they had, methods of asana and breath and all this other stuff.
And so some teachers, before you could get any mental technique, you had to do a lot of the physical before. So
and they emphasized diet and taking good care of yourself, because, it's the body is necessary. It's what we inhabit. And people can go to extremes in either way. That's why, the Buddha created what he called the middle path. So it was moderation. So there's correctives and also correctives in the authoritarian and structures of organization. So I was very glad she was able to address frequency of power abuse in some of these communities. She, as she pointed out, not hardly limited to the, world of Western Buddhism and yoga and all that. It's as anybody following the recent history in the Catholic Church knows.
Exactly. Yeah. So well done. Another terrific interview. And again, go to our archives at spiritmatterstalk.com. And also on YouTube, you can see us and see our guests at Spirit Matters Talk. We've been doing that for the last several months. So there are a number of interviews and discussions there. And please subscribe. Hit that little red button and subscribe. It doesn't cost anything. And if you would like to contribute to help keep us on the air and free and open to the public, you can do that at spiritmatterstalk.com. There's an explanation of how that's done. And we are not a nonprofit, so it's not a donation, but we'll make use of any of those contributions to keep it going and to keep feeding our archives. And and that's a great education. Forget about taking a course in comparative religions or spirituality or whatever. Go to our archives. It's free. Do it at your own speed, and Phil and I are always available.
I'm looking forward to a Ph.D. candidate doing a dissertation on the Spirit Matters podcast and the content therein.
We will give them full support, full
emotional
support anyway.
Next time.
Next time. Over and out.